The sequence begins with the very popular opening moves: pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, knight to c6. After you play pawn to d4, the game transitions into the Scotch Gambit. In this position, the move pawn to d4 attacks the center pawn and threatens to push forward, chasing the knight. As a result, black will almost always capture the pawn with pawn takes d4. From here, you have several options, but let's explore the riskiest one, which also offers the highest probability of delivering a quick checkmate. This involves playing knight to g5. This move carries some inherent risk and isn't the most objectively sound, but it is a high-risk strategy. If black is unfamiliar with this trap, you have a strong chance of winning within a few moves. After knight to g5, your intentions become clear. You are targeting the f7 square, which is a weak point in black's position. On your next move, you can play bishop to c4, reinforcing the attack on f7 and setting up a powerful threat. In this position, most of your opponents will be tempted to play pawn to h6 to kick your knight back. However, instead of retreating, you play knight takes f7, sacrificing the knight and exposing black's king. The king is forced to capture the knight with king takes f7 because otherwise, white's attack on the king becomes overwhelming. After king takes f7, you deliver a check with bishop to c4. At this point, black's most natural reaction, and the most commonly played move, is to retreat the king to safety by playing king to e8. You can deliver a forced checkmate. You play queen to h5, delivering a check to the king. If black attempts to block or move the king, your next move is queen to f7, delivering a decisive blow. This position is similar to the scholar's mate. If black tries to prolong the game by moving the king, you can continue chasing it. For example, you might play bishop to f4, forcing the king to wander. After a few more precise moves like queen to d5, king to b6, and finally queen to b5, you achieve a picturesque checkmate with the king trapped in the center of the board. Since black's previous moves are very natural, you are highly likely to reach this position. Now, let's move on to the another trap. After pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, the most standard chess moves, we still proceed with the Scotch Gambit by playing pawn to d4. When black captures the pawn with pawn takes d4, instead of playing knight to g5, which, while aggressive, is not objectively the strongest move, we play a more logical move, bishop to c4. This develops the bishop and puts pressure on black. At this point, black has two popular responses, either bishop to c5 or knight to f6. As black seeks to develop their minor pieces and prepare to castle, let's analyze bishop to c5, a natural move that develops the bishop while also defending the pawn on d4. Here, you respond with pawn to c3, threatening to recapture the pawn on d4 and attack the bishop. The most commonly played move by black in this position is pawn takes c3. But this turns out to be a critical mistake. It allows you to play bishop takes f7, sacrificing the bishop to expose black's king. After king takes f7, which is nearly forced, you play queen to d5, delivering a double attack on the king and the bishop. This forces black to retreat the king to e8, as king to f8 leads to even worse positions due to queen takes c5 with check. Instead of immediately capturing on c5, you can insert an intermediate move, queen to h5 check. This forces black to play pawn to g6, which further weakens their pawn structure in the long dark square diagonal. This additional weakness can be exploited in the future, giving white a strong attacking position. This position significantly favors white and is almost hopeless for black. While it may not seem like an immediate checkmate is possible, notice that black's king has already moved, meaning it can no longer castle and will remain exposed in the center of the board. Additionally, the long diagonal is extremely weak, leaving black vulnerable. For example, if black tries to save a pawn or capture elsewhere, you can simply thank them and recapture. This leaves black in even greater trouble. Your plan from here is straightforward. Continue developing your pieces with simple moves such as castling, knight takes c3, and bishop to g5. These natural moves strengthen your position while taking advantage of black's exposed king and weaknesses along the diagonal. With this approach, you can confidently exploit black's vulnerabilities and secure a win. Here's an example of how white can capitalize on this position. Black played queen to e7, offering an exchange of queens. However, since we want to attack the exposed king, exchanging queens is not ideal. Instead, white played queen takes c3, capturing the pawn and simultaneously threatening the rook on h8. This position highlights how effective white's pawn on g6 is, compared to if it were safely on g7 for black. Black noticed that the pawn on e4 was unprotected and captured it with queen takes e4. At this point, instead of covering the king with a defensive move, white played a bold move. King to d1. The idea is to prepare rook to e1, creating threats along the open file and winning significant material. Black tried one last tactic with queen to d5, but after bishop to d2, it became clear that not only was Black's king in danger, but the rook on h8 was also hanging. With no way to save both the rook and their position, Black would have to sacrifice material, leaving their king still exposed. This position is completely winning for White. This concludes the analysis of Black's response with bishop to c5, where White plays pawn to c3 to gain a strong advantage. However, another example, Black play knight to f6, let me share how you can win in this position. Now, let's dive into the variation that almost guarantees a win in this position. It still exploits the weakness of the f7 square. You play knight to g5, attacking the f7 pawn twice. At this point, the most natural move for Black is pawn to d5, defending against the attack. After that, you trade pawns on d5 with pawn takes d5, and Black recaptures with knight takes d5. Now, you've already reached a winning position once again. It's extremely difficult, nearly impossible, for Black to realize that their move, knight takes d5, is a fatal error. It looks like the most natural move to play. However, Black's position crumbles in a manner similar to the fried liver attack, if you're familiar with that. But here's the key, instead of playing knight takes f7 immediately, which would be a mistake, you first castle. If you were to play knight takes f7 right away, Black could respond with queen to e7 check, ruining your plans. That's why it's crucial to castle first. By castling, you maintain the pressure and Black remains defenseless. The combined threats against their position are overwhelming. Your knight and bishop create immense pressure along the diagonal, while rook to e1 will attack Black's king along the f-file. Additionally, in some variations, you have queen to f3, which can attack both the knight and the pawn on f7. Black simply cannot cope with the coordinated threats and their position collapses. In this position, White has far too many threats for Black to handle. Most often, Black will play bishop to e7, trying to move their king to safety. At this moment, you sacrifice your knight with knight takes f7. After Black's king captures with king takes f7, you play queen to f3, delivering a double attack, targeting both the king and the knight on d5. This allows you to regain the material on the next move, but now Black's king is completely exposed. From here, Black usually plays bishop to e6, trying to defend. You trade bishops with bishop takes e6, and it becomes clear that Black's king is in serious trouble. You can continue your attack with simple, effective moves. For example, you can play rook to e1, delivering a check. If the king retreats, you follow up with queen to b3, checking the king from the other side. The king often ends up retreating to f8. From there, you can activate your rook and continue the assault. Moves like queen takes b7 allow you to capture pawns and maintain pressure. You are attacking the knight, threatening other pawns, and can play bishop to f4 to intensify the attack. Ultimately, Black's position collapses under the pressure, and victory for White becomes inevitable. I hope you understand all variation. If you benefited from this video, then subscribe.